He thought he was marrying a shadow, a woman so quiet, so unremarkable, she might as well have been part of the furniture. But in a land baked by sun and blistered by secrets, nothing stays hidden for long. And no one is ever what they seem. When Jeremiah Cole asked Ruth Langley to marry him, he figured he was throwing a lifeline to a forgotten widow. He didn't realize he was handing her the match that would burn everything he thought he knew about love. The sun hung high and cruel above the dusty plains, the air thick with heat and unspoken desperation. Jeremiah stood outside the rusting frame of the Last Chance Tavern, his hat tugged low to shield his tired eyes. The letter in his hand crinkled with sweat and dread, a final notice from the land office. 28 days to show a family presence or kiss the ranch goodbye. He muttered a curse and stuffed the paper deep into his coat pocket. Ever since Helen passed, the vultures had been circling. A man without a wife was a risk, they said. Land didn't just need hands, it needed hearts, homes, Sunday dinners, and the illusion of happiness. Stability, they called it. What a steaming pile of horsespit. Jeremiah stepped down from the saloon porch, boots thumping against weathered planks, and headed through the center of Dust Hollow, a town clinging to life like a cactus in a drought. Eyes tracked him. Tongues whispered, "There goes Cole, lost his woman, his luck, and now his land." He walked on. Let them talk. Gossip didn't build fences or brand cattle. As he passed Langley's General Supply, he spotted a woman behind the dusty window, arranging jars with the slow precision of someone used to being unnoticed. She wore a faded grey dress, her hair tied in a tight braid, face bare of makeup or expression. Just a woman doing the work nobody praised. "Ruth Langley," murmured old Miss Dory, the baker's wife, who was sweeping her stoop. "Poor soul. Husband froze to death last December. No kin left, just ghosts and chores." Jeremiah hesitated. He wasn't looking for love. He barely remembered what it felt like. But something about the way Ruth moved steady, no nonsense, like the wind couldn't move her if it tried to spark something brittle and buried inside him. He needed a wife, not a fairy tale. And if she said no, well, he'd already lost too much to protect his pride. That evening, Jeremiah stood awkwardly outside Ruth's boarding house, kicking the dust off his boots. He knocked once, twice, and stepped back, rehearsing the words in his head like a fool. The door creaked open just enough for her to peer through, her sharp grey eyes wary. "Mr. Cole," she said, more suspicion than welcome. "Evening, Miss Langley," his voice caught. "Could I have a word?" She watched him for a breath too long, then stepped aside. The room behind her was bare, but clean soap, oil, and solitude in the air. A single chair, a thin bed, a small wooden cross above the window. He stayed standing. "I'll be blunt. I'm not here for courting or sweet words. I need a wife. Not for love for the law. The ranch is at stake." Ruth's fingers tightened on the doorframe. "And you thought I'd do?" He met her eyes. "You're alone. I'm desperate." She didn't blink. "What do I get in return?" "A roof, food, protection." The word rang hollow, even to his ears. He hadn't protected anyone since Helen, not even himself. Her eyes flicked to the pale sunset leaking through the window. For a long time, she didn't speak. Then, with a nod like steel, she whispered, "Tomorrow, Pastor leaves town Sunday." Jeremiah felt the air return to his lungs. She shut the door before he could say anything more. He stood there a long while, staring at the cracked paint and listening to the shuffle of her steps fade inside. He had a wife. He had a plan. But as he walked back toward his hollow house and dying fields, something heavier than failure sat on his chest. Marriage might keep the land, but it wouldn't save them. You can seal two people together with paper and promises, but wounds, hers and his, ran deeper than ink. And some debts don't get paid in coin. They cost pieces of you, hope, blood, whatever was left when the rest is gone. The widow and the rancher had made a bargain, but neither of them had yet grasped the price. The next morning broke like fire, the sun already blistering the cracked road, as Jeremiah stood outside the chapel, suffocating in his one clean shirt. He felt like a man walking to his hanging, not his wedding. Ruth arrived alone. No flowers, no guests, just that plain grey dress and a white kerchief knotted over her braid. She kept her spine straight as folks stared, some with pity, others with smugness. "Look at that," someone whispered loud enough. "Can't even get a proper woman. Had to settle for Ruth the recluse." Jeremiah heard it. Ruth did too. A flicker of something, not pain exactly, but something close crossed her face, and it carved a sharp little hole in his chest. The preacher cleared his throat and the ceremony started. Fast, cold, clinical, no poems, no soft looks, just duty. Jeremiah slid a dull brass ring onto Ruth's finger. "You may kiss the bride," the preacher mumbled. He leaned in, pressed a kiss to her forehead like an apology carved in dust, and stepped back. The crowd dissolved before the final word was even spoken. No cheers, just more whispers. "Won't make it through the season. Fool thinks land's enough to build a life." He didn't offer his arm, just muttered, "Let's go," and led her through the noise and heat toward a future neither asked for. They rode in silence. Ruth sat sideways on an old mule borrowed from a neighbor, her gaze never straying from the horizon. He stole glances, wondering not for the first time why she said yes. Hunger? Pride? Maybe something else altogether. They passed the dried-up creek, skeletal trees, and the rusted fence posts that marked the edge of the coal land. The house loomed ahead, sagging, grayed with rot, haunted by memories and mice. Jeremiah helped her down from the saddle. Her hand was cold. She didn't look at him. Inside, the place was stripped to the bones, crooked table, cracked plates, dust-stiff curtains. 2 bedrooms upstairs, one untouched since Helen. "Take whichever you want," he said. "I'll take the small one," she replied quietly, setting down her bag-worn fabric tied with a belt. He watched her a moment longer, then escaped to the porch. The air felt less crowded there. He lit a smoke with trembling fingers and stared at the land. His land, dry, stubborn. Not dead yet, but damn close. Inside, Ruth unpacked a folded quilt, laid it over the narrow bed, and placed a single sketch on the nightstand, a hand-drawn tree, delicate and defiant. Her only piece of beauty. The sun dipped low, and the sky ignited in colors too vivid for a world so tired. Jeremiah stayed out until the cold crept in. When he came back, Ruth was at the kitchen table, sewing a torn sleeve, quiet, precise. Neither spoke, no need to. The deal was struck, the terms understood. Surviving was all that mattered now, together or not. That first night in the coal house was colder than the wind outside. Ruth sat alone at the table, her hands folded like she was still waiting for something that never came. Upstairs, Jeremiah paced. Then silence. No greetings, no warmth. Just wood creaking, wind howling, and 2 strangers bound by desperation. When the fire died down, Ruth wrapped her shawl tighter and climbed to her room. The bed sagged in the middle. The quilt offered little warmth. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe. It wasn't fear that kept her up. She'd survived worse storms, hunger, grief. But now there was a new emptiness, a silent ache. Not for love, she knew better. But for a scrap of decency, kindness, humanity. She hadn't expected affection, but maybe she'd hoped for something more than silence. Sleep came slow, long after the rest of the world had surrendered. Restless sleep haunted Ruth's fragile frame like a ghost she couldn't shake. She tossed in the cold bed, her dreams just out of reach, unfinished things that fluttered away the moment she opened her eyes. Morning arrived like a punch to the gut. Jeremiah was already outside when Ruth stepped onto the porch, clutching her shawl against the morning chill. He swung an axe with hard, angry rhythm, each strike a battle, each grunt a war cry. Ruth watched for a moment, silent, before heading toward the henhouse. The door dangled crookedly on one hinge. Most of the hens had escaped and were squawking in the weeds. She spent the next hour coaxing them back, using grain from a forgotten sack in the barn. By the time she returned to the house, her skirt was muddy and her hands scratched. Jeremiah sat at the table, cradling a cup of bitter coffee, eyes fixed on nothing. "There's bread," he muttered, not looking at her. Ruth found it, a dry, crumbling loaf swaddled in a threadbare cloth. She cut herself a slice, sat down across from him, and they chewed in silence, the meal as joyless as a funeral. "You don't gotta hang around here all day," he finally said, eyes still averted. "Ain't much for a woman to do." Ruth's lips thinned. "I'm used to work." He shrugged like it didn't matter either way. "Suit yourself." Hat in hand, he walked out the door, leaving a trail of dust in his wake. The days blurred into each other like pages in a grim book. Jeremiah rode out at dawn, mending fences and fighting the land. Ruth cleaned the house, tended the chickens, and stitched the clothes. She prepared simple meals from a pantry that held more air than food. They exchanged few words, not out of malice, but because silence was easier. Each night, Jeremiah returned, exhausted, and retreated upstairs without a word. Ruth stayed by the fire, Patching sleeves or reading from a faded prayer book she barely believed in anymore. The house grew clean but stayed cold, not from lack of warmth, but from something deeper: grief, distrust, the kind of emptiness that sinks into your bones. Ruth understood. She carried her own ice inside. One afternoon, while scrubbing the kitchen floor, her hand brushed something beneath the cabinet, a tiny wooden horse, chipped and faded. She turned it over gently. A child's toy. His child. The one Jeremiah had buried with his wife. Ruth placed the toy back where she found it, her chest tight. This house wasn't just haunted, it was full of grief too raw to bury. She stood slowly and looked out the kitchen window. The fields stretched dry and dead. She had come here just to survive. But somewhere inside, the most dangerous thing still flickered, a fragile, ridiculous hope that maybe life could be more than survival. For now, that hope would have to wait. The routine carried on, each day stitched with dust and silence. Ruth rarely saw Jeremiah's face without the shadow of his hat. He left before the sun rose and came back when the stars were already stitched into the sky. At first, Ruth told herself it was enough. She had food, shelter, a place even if it was one built from broken things. But some nights, loneliness hit her like a hammer to the ribs. It gnawed at her until she felt hollow. Then, one evening, a sharp crash outside yanked her from her thoughts. She ran to the porch. Jeremiah was on his knees beside the corral, breath ragged. The gate had shattered. One of the horses, the bay mare, had kicked him square in the side. He tried to rise, clutching his ribs. "Don't," he gasped, waving her off with a bloodied hand. "You're not fine," she snapped, already at his side. He was heavy, all grit and stubbornness, but after a few awkward fumbles, he leaned on her just enough to make it back to the house. Inside, she lowered him into a chair and grabbed a basin. He watched her through narrowed eyes as she cleaned the blood and checked the swelling. "Use some kind of healer," he mumbled. "My father was a schoolmaster," she replied, wrapping the gauze. "But he taught me plenty, that rib's cracked." He grunted. She paused, hand resting lightly on his chest, where his heart thudded behind the dirt and denim strong, but guarded. "You need to rest," she murmured, stepping back. His mouth twitched. It might have been a smile. Or just pain. He staggered to the old sofa. Ruth draped a blanket over him without a word. She turned to leave when he asked, "Why do you say yes?" She froze. "What?" "I mean it. Why agree to all this?" She didn't face him. "Because I know what it's like to need something you can't ask for." Silence swallowed the room. When she finally looked back, he wasn't glaring. He looked almost human. Maybe she wasn't the only one walking around with invisible wounds. The next morning, Jeremiah insisted on working. Ruth stood on the porch, arms folded, watching him wince with every step. That afternoon, with him gone, Ruth decided the house needed more than soap, it needed something alive. She walked to the dry creek bed and gathered stones. Near the porch, she arranged them in a circle. From her carpet bag, she pulled a pouch of wildflower seeds. Hardy things, survivors. Like her, as her fingers worked the cracked earth, Ruth felt something impossible rise in her chest. Hope. Tiny, foolish, but growing. Then the sky turned. Where once it had been a pale, blistering blue, now heavy clouds rolled in like a curse. A low rumble shook the air. Ruth glanced up from the garden, her stomach dropping. A wall of wind, dust, and rain barreled toward the ranch like a stampede of gods. She dropped the basket of eggs she'd gathered and ran. The animals first. The chickens were screaming, the horses panicked. Her hands bled, dragging them into the barn. Her skirt tore on a fence post. Rain sliced through her shawl like knives. Mud sucked at her boots. And Sam, where was he? He'd gone out to fix the fence, far from the house. Too far. She lashed the barn doors shut and turned for the house. Rain fell in sheets now, thunder cracked, the wind howled. Twice she slipped in the muck, her hands trembled as she fought the door latch. Then she was inside. And then nothing. Hours blurred. The storm tore at the windows. The house groaned under the weight of the wind. Ruth curled beside the fireplace, wrapped in a soaked blanket, feeding the flame scraps of furniture and hope. Her teeth chattered, her limbs shook, but worse than the cold was the fear. He was still out there. She tried to pray, but the words felt useless. By nightfall, her mind was half gone. She faded in and out, her body too tired to care. Then the door slammed open with a crash. Jeremiah. Soaked to the skin, mud from boots to knees, He staggered in, saw her immediately, and crossed the room in 3 fast strides. "Ruth," he breathed, falling to his knees. "You're back," she whispered. Her lips were blue. He peeled away the wet blanket, replacing it with his coat. "You should have stayed inside." "I had to save the animals," she murmured, smiling weakly. He cursed not at her, at himself. He should have been here. He scooped her up barely more than a feather in his arms and carried her upstairs, into his room, into his bed. He piled every blanket over her he could find. And he didn't leave. All night, he stoked the fire, fed her broth, held her hand. He never let go. When dawn crept over the battered plains, Ruth stirred. Her eyes opened, clear, and he was there collapsed in the chair beside her, exhaustion painted across his face. "You're safe," he rasped. Ruth tried to smile, but her lips trembled. A single tear slipped down her cheek, and without thinking, Jeremiah reached out his rough fingers, brushing it away with a gentleness that neither of them had expected. For a long moment, neither spoke. They simply looked at one another, stripped of everything but the truth in their eyes. No deals, no defenses. In that fragile silence, something shifted, something small and sacred. The storm had left its mark on the land, scarred and soaked, but still breathing. And somehow, so were they. For the first time since they'd made that desperate pact, Ruth and Jeremiah realized survival wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The days after the storm brought change that felt almost holy. The land, once brittle and cracked, now held pockets of water in its deepest fractures. The air smelled cleaner, sweet, even though every step still sank in thick mud, and the fences now sagged like drunkards. Something was different. Ruth moved through the wreckage with a quiet fire in her sleeves rolled, skirts soaked, hair tangled by the wind. She fixed the henhouse door, patched the roof with whatever scraps she could find, and gathered broken limbs into tidy bundles. But it was what she did next that left Jeremiah standing still. She planted a garden. Right there, by the steps of the porch, a fragile, foolish, beautiful patch of wildflower seeds pressed gently into the newly softened earth. Not potatoes or onions, not survival food, wildflowers. Jeremiah watched from the barn, arms folded, his brow furrowed so deeply it might have split. What kind of woman planted something that wasn't meant to feed or fend? She believed tomorrow was coming. He didn't, not anymore, but she did. And that, more than the storm or the fire or the pain, rattled him. That night, long after Ruth had gone to bed, he found himself outside again. The sky stretched forever above him, stars sharp and endless. The air had a bite, and he welcomed it. He crouched near the fresh garden bed, just soil and seeds for now. No promises, no guarantees. His hand drifted across the dirt. For the first time in a long while, he touched the land not to measure or demand, but simply to feel it. This wasn't farming. This was faith. He sat there a long time, silent. The next few days brought changes as quiet as they were profound. Ruth's little garden became a sanctuary. Every morning before sunrise, she knelt there in the soft earth. Jeremiah began leaving small things nearby. An old tin bucket, a bit of chicken wire, a broken trowel he'd mended with care. She never said a word, but she always noticed, always smiled. And the house, it changed too. Ruth scrubbed the windows until the light could pour in. She patched the curtains. She coaxed the old stove back to life, even managed to bake bread that didn't taste like despair. Once, when a hen wandered inside and refused to leave, Ruth let out a laugh soft, surprised the kind of laugh that filled the room. Jeremiah found himself smiling more, telling himself it was the rain, the break in the heat. But it wasn't. It was her. The widow he had married to satisfy a bank's demand was giving his home, and his hollow self, something close to life again. One evening, they sat together on the porch. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was soft. Ruth nodded to the field. Tiny green shoots were poking from the dirt. "Even this place," she said quietly, "can grow something if you let it." Jeremiah didn't answer at first. He just stared at the garden, at her, at the truth she'd buried in the soil. Finally, his voice cracked through the quiet. "Maybe it can." Ruth turned toward him, her face bathed in the gold light of dusk. And for the first time, he let himself wonder, could hope grow in him too? Autumn crept over Dust Hollow with strange kindness. The sun softened, the wind grew gentle, nights stretched long and slow. It was during one of those nights that Jeremiah discovered a truth that hit him harder than any storm. He hadn't meant to snoop. He was just hunting for nails in the back storeroom. A place full of rusted tools and the kind of broken things you're too stubborn to throw away. That's where he found the trunk. Tucked under an old saddle and tarp, it was heavy, locked, forgotten. He pried it open. Letters, dozens of them, written in elegant sweeping script. They spoke of poetry, cities, ideas. And at the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, he found the certificate. Ruth Langley, Bachelor of Letters, Boston Academy for Young Women. Jeremiah stared at it like it was written in another language. A woman of education, culture, maybe even privilege, living here with him? The questions pressed into his chest like iron. The next morning, he found her at the garden, coaxing tender green leaves from the earth. She looked up when she saw him, smiled the way she always did. He didn't smile back. Instead, he handed her the paper. Her face drained of color, she rose slowly, dusting off her skirt. Her voice was steady but small. "I didn't want you to find that." Jeremiah waited. "My father taught at a university," she said. "He wanted more for me, a life of books and ease. I was engaged once, rich, promised the world." Her voice shifted, hardened. "But rumors spread. Lies. That I wasn't proper. It didn't matter if they were true. In Boston, your name is worth more than your truth. I left before the shame could finish me." She met his gaze. "I thought, maybe out here, I could be someone else, not judged for my past." Her words broke something in him, because he knew what shame tasted like. He had lived with it every day since Helen's death. He stepped closer. "You didn't owe me your past," he said gruffly. "You still don't." Ruth's eyes shimmered. "I just wanted to matter again." He reached out, gently touching her fingers. "You do," he said. "You always have." Her hand tightened around his. For the first time since they'd spoken their joyless vows, something real passed between them. Not obligation, not survival. Truth. And maybe, just maybe, love. But Dust Hollow didn't let peace last long. The wind changed again, but this time it wasn't rain it carried. It was smoke. Jeremiah smelled it first, sharp, acidic, wrong. He shot off the porch, scanning the horizon. A black ribbon of smoke curled up near the eastern fence line. "Ruth!" he bellowed, already sprinting toward the barn. She ran from the garden, skirts flying, fear flashing in her eyes. "The pasture's on fire!" he shouted. "We've got to move!" Without a second's hesitation, she grabbed 2 buckets and ran for the well. Water splashed, the pump groaned. Jeremiah saddled the horses with shaking hands. There was no one to call. No neighbors close enough. It was just them. He tied wet burlap over the horses' noses and drove them toward the safest field. Ruth was already soaking gunny sacks, her face grim. "Go to town," he shouted. "I'm not leaving you," she yelled back, fierce enough to make him freeze. For a heartbeat, they just looked at each other. No plain widow, no ruined rancher, just 2 fighters back to back against the blaze. They worked like possessed souls, hauling water, beating flames, stomping fire. Smoke filled their lungs, the heat peeled skin, ash fell like snow. At one point, he lost her. "Ruth!" he roared, heart slamming in panic. Through the smoke, he saw her struggling to free a calf from a collapsed fence. Flames curled toward them. Without thought, he ran, ripped the fence aside with pure force. He pulled the calf with one arm, her with the other, dragging them both back to the barn. They collapsed, coughing, against the cold stone wall. For a moment, they didn't speak, just breathed, ash on their lips, hearts pounding. Then Ruth turned her soot-covered face toward him. Her hand reached out in the dark, searching through ash and aching muscles until it found his. Jeremiah's calloused fingers closed around hers, gripping hard. They had done it. The barn still stood. The animals were safe. The fences were wrecked. The fields charred, but the heart of the ranch was still beating. And so were they. Later that night, when the last embers had died down and the wind was finally quiet, they sat on the porch steps side by side. Jeremiah's arm wrapped protectively around Ruth's shoulders, and she leaned into him without hesitation. Above them, the stars blinked down, distant and unbothered witnesses to their bruised triumph. "You should have run," Jeremiah murmured, guilt tight in his throat. Ruth shook her head against his chest. "I stayed, because this is my home too." Jeremiah closed his eyes. It wasn't just survival anymore. She hadn't chosen the ranch, she had chosen him. not out of need or duty, but with clear eyes and a steady heart. In that scorched, smoke-stained night, Jeremiah finally understood. He'd chosen her too, not for convenience, not for appearances, but for something more dangerous. Love. The fire had left deep wounds across the land, fields blackened, fences broken, the smell of ash soaked into the soil, but somehow life had already begun to rise again, slow and defiant. So had they. Jeremiah moved differently now, less like a man bracing for collapse and more like one determined to rebuild. Each morning, he woke before the sun and threw himself into the land, mending what had been lost, not just with his hands but with his heart. But he was building something else too, something secret. Ruth didn't know about the old storage shed near the garden, not yet. He worked on it quietly, covering the windows, hauling supplies under moonlight. When she asked what he was doing, he offered only grunts and distractions. Until the day she tried peeking. He caught her slipping around the side of the shed. He just shook his head, mischief dancing in eyes that had long forgotten how to sparkle. Not yet. She laughed, and for a moment it felt like summer blooming in winter. Then, one morning, the first frost painted the ranch silver. Jeremiah woke before the world stirred. His chest thudded like a drum as he brewed strong coffee and waited by the kitchen door. Ruth entered, her shawl clutched tight. He stood so suddenly he nearly toppled his chair. "Come with me," he said. No questions, just trust. She followed him outside, their breaths fogging the air. They walked to the shed. Jeremiah paused at the door, fingers trembling on the latch. "This is for you," he said, voice low. He pushed the door open. Ruth stepped inside and froze. The once abandoned shed was transformed. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books, poetry, history, philosophy, some dog-eared, some clearly new. A desk stood in the center, hand-carved and sturdy, with a worn chair and a small lantern waiting to be lit. On the far wall, a chalkboard gleamed, blank and expectant. It wasn't just a room. It was a library, a school, a sanctuary. Tears filled Ruth's eyes, blurring the shelves. "You remembered," she whispered. Jeremiah scratched the back of his neck. "I figured you'd given up enough to be here, figured it was time you got something back." Ruth crossed the room like someone stepping into a dream. Her fingers brushed the spine of a book with reverence. She could see it now, a place where she could teach again. Young ranch hands, children, anyone who hungered to learn, knowledge blooming alongside the crops. A life not just rebuilt, but reborn. She turned to him, her throat tight. "I never wanted riches," she said, voice shaking, "or grand promises. I just wanted to be seen." Jeremiah cupped her face in his hands, lifting her gaze. "I see you, Ruth Langley," he said. "I always have." In that quiet shed, wrapped in the scent of fresh wood and old stories, she knew. This was home, not the land, not the walls. Him. The ranch didn't recover overnight. Scars remained, the blackened ground, the fence posts like skeleton ribs against the sky. But healing, Ruth knew, wasn't about erasing the pain. It was about outliving it. And they did. Together, they fixed what could be saved and forgave what couldn't. Winter rolled in with its long nights and frozen breath, but they faced it hand in hand. They became a team, two halves of something whole, moving around each other with ease, with care, not out of need, but out of love. On a rare, bright Sunday, with the ground still hard beneath their boots and the sky cracked open in blue, Jeremiah took her hand and led her to the old cottonwood tree, the one near the fence line that had fallen long ago. The place where he once stood alone, drowning in silence. Now he stood with her. He cleared his throat, nerves suddenly taking hold. He'd faced wild bulls and lightning storms with a steady jaw. But this? "I messed a lot up," he began, voice gravelly. "Thoughtland was all I had left. Figured it was enough." He looked down at her hand in his fingers, calloused and warm. But it ain't. From his pocket, he pulled a ring. Iron, simple, handmade, strong. Like them. Ruth's breath caught. "I don't have poetry," he said, thumb brushing her knuckles, "but I got this. I want you. Not the past, not the idea, just you." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Her eyes brimmed. "You taught me what love looks like," he said. Ruth smiled wide and real. "And you showed me," she whispered, "that even broken ground can bloom." He kissed her then, slowly, with everything he hadn't known how to say. The world faded away. No debts, no doubts. Only them. Seasons would shift, storms would come, fences would fall again, but there would be laughter, harvests, mornings filled with coffee and firelight, nights warmed by shared breath and shared dreams. In the dry soil of Dust Hollow, where nothing was meant to grow, they had built something stronger than a ranch. They had built love. Steady, fierce, enduring. A reminder to us all. Sometimes the most beautiful things don't grow in perfect gardens. They grow from scorched earth, from second chances, from the brave souls who refuse to give up. If this story moved you, share your favorite moment in the comments, and don't forget to follow or subscribe for more stories of love, grit, and hope in the unlikeliest places.